I'm really excited for this keynote. One of the things that we really wanted to do with this event, when we were originally thinking about it, it was somewhere between this kind of free-form, panel-driven tech event along the lines of South by Southwest, and somewhere, on the spectrum, then there's TED, or somebody who makes you think. And what we wanted to do was test the content along the spectrum, what most resonated with people. And with our keynotes, we're really trying to bring people in here who make you think. And Andrew is one of those people who will definitely do that. So, or not, maybe. He'll try. And so, in a world where people talk of being iterative and trying new things, Andrew's a great example of somebody who's had a number of amazing opportunities and continues to find new amazing things to do. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Andrew.
Thank you very much. I always wanted to be introduced by one of those deep voices that starts off saying, "In a world where..." So what I'm going to try to do this afternoon is take a stab at explaining some big things that are going on and trying to tie them together with particular attention to those of you in this room that are either thinking about, planning to, or will someday start a company, an internet company. So let's see how this goes. The title for the talk is The Fight for the Future, the Internet, Censorship, Surveillance, and You. And so the first story that I want to talk about is the events of the end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011 in North Africa. This was somewhat fancifully mislabeled a set of social media revolutions, Facebook revolutions, Twitter revolutions. That's kind of a crazy way to think about what went on in Tunisia and Egypt. But nevertheless, something really important took place there. And what was interesting was to think about the ways in which North Africa and the revolutions that unfolded there contrasted with what happened in 1989 in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Obviously, I don't need to point this out, but the pre-internet events that took place starting in East Germany in 1989. And there was this really sort of kind of cartoonish debate that erupted in US nerdland in 2011, which was, to what extent did social media and the internet and so forth cause what happened in Egypt or cause what happened in Tunisia? In retrospect, that's a self-evidently kind of bananas way to think about what happens when people that have been oppressed for 30 or 40 years ruthlessly by their government finally take to the streets in order to topple that repressive regime. But I think it is fair to say that something happened, not least of which because Egyptians and Tunisians seem to think that Facebook and Twitter were somehow important to what went on in their countries. In parallel to this kind of like excitement about the ability of Egyptians and Tunisians to connect with each other, get out on the streets, and protest, there were some dark shadows that sort of emerged in the same narrative. So in Egypt in 2011, oh shoot, this does not look very good on the screen, but let me go into the zoomed in one. So in Egypt in 2011, the government undertook a whole range of activities to try to deal with the street protests that were taking place. They engaged in large-scale surveillance of mobile networks and the people using them. They, at one point, actually shut down the internet in Egypt. And how they did this is kind of interesting. If you look at this map here, what you see are all of the submarine fiber cables that run past Egypt. So Egypt is in this extraordinarily strategic location in the global communications network because it stands at the intersection of Europe, Africa, and Asia. And the Suez Canal in particular, just like it's the shortest route from Asia to Europe for ships, it's also the shortest route for internet cables, communications cables, phone and internet. And so what you see here is this incredibly dense collection of bandwidth that runs right through the Suez Canal. Actually, what it really does is run to the town of Suez, and it goes overland in Egypt up to Alexandria, these different cables. These are cables like FLAG, the CME 2, 3, 4, and 5 cables, and so forth. And together, they represent just about all of the communications that run between Asia and Europe, and by extension, often into the US and back. And so what Egypt had done, which was extremely clever, was concentrated all of the bandwidth going in and out of Egypt to these cables through a single building, 26 Ramses Street in Cairo. And just a big interconnection point, and they had given Telecom Egypt a monopoly in all of the communications traffic going in and out of Egypt. So even though there were these huge fat pipes carrying tons of traffic, the Egyptian government had very cleverly concentrated all of Egyptians' access to the global internet through this one building. I'm telling a slightly simplified version of the story. The reality is a little bit more complicated on the ground. There were a couple of other alternate paths in and out. For example, the education and university network had its own independent connection that went out through the Mediterranean to Europe. But in the somewhat simplified version of the story, this degree of concentration for the commercial connectivity options in Egypt meant that the government could literally pull the plug. And so indeed they did. This graph shows the major connectivity providers in Egypt, and you can see literally kind of minute by minute how the different carriers shut down. It's almost as though, and this is my kind of mental image, I don't know if this is actually what happened, but somebody just went running through 26 Ramsey Street and pulled the electrical cables out of all the switches and routers that were located there because they flatlined within a matter of a couple of hours. You can see what this means for services. These are some great charts that Google provides for its different services. You can look these up online. You can see here where all of Egypt's traffic to Google just flattens out and then reaches its earlier levels when it gets turned back on. And so the interesting point about this, here for example, is YouTube traffic in Iran since they started blocking. The interesting thing about this is that what it shows is the physicality of the internet and the ability of smart governments to take these communications avenues that empower individuals to take collective action, organize themselves, get out on the street together, give each other courage sufficient to go out and risk confrontation with the tanks and with the soldiers that they will face. At the same time, enables the government to literally shut down the internet and also do surveillance, which I'm going to talk about in a second. An interesting coda, by the way, is that since the Egyptian revolution anyway, the student organizations and the young people that used Facebook as their primary organizing tool have been vastly outmatched in the post-Mubarak politics of Egypt by these pre-existing organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood that were extremely well organized prior to the eruption of any of this kind of street protest. And it just also goes to show you the limitations that we are now confronting with the kinds of tools and capabilities that I'm talking about. Real-world organization turns out to matter tremendously in real-world politics in the post-revolution age. All right, so let's switch gears for a second. That's a little bit of the Egypt story and the good and the bad. One of the things that you might have been excited about if you're an American was reading about the Stuxnet virus in Iran. So the Stuxnet virus was an unbelievably sophisticated piece of software. It's still only just speculated that maybe the US produced it as a matter of a governmental program. But regardless, the Stuxnet virus had the effect of going into the Natanz facility in Iran and with incredible pinpoint precision attaching itself to the control software for centrifuges, and in particular these contraptions that enrich and refine uranium into weapons-grade material. And the virus was able to extremely subtly slow down and speed up these centrifuges well beyond their tolerance points and just cause them to basically fry out. But they did it by allowing them to run for long periods of time normally and so forth. Anyway, an incredibly sophisticated thing. That seems kind of cool. That's a government using an internet virus to achieve the ends of nuclear non-proliferation, which is something that you might agree with. And similarly, you might be excited about some of the things that this very loosely confederated collection of internet activists, hacktivists they're sometimes called, known as anonymous, which is to say they do things like they've chased down child porn networks, Anonymous has tried to support the availability of WikiLeaks materials across national borders. They have done a lot as a group to support the Occupy movements in different countries. They preserve censored materials and try to make them available in various ways. But anyway, the movement that Anonymous represents has, at least in my estimation, in large measure, pursued kind of socially worthy ends. What's troubling, though, is when you see these same techniques of state action or loosely confederated and unaffiliated actors working together used in very different and, I would say, very scary and harmful ways. A recent example is the Syrian regime's use of viruses and spyware against the Free Syrian Forces, the dissidents, and now the Free Syrian Army formal opposition to the Assad regime. What you see here is a website that was put up called Anti-Hacker that advertised itself as anti-spyware, antivirus software with a nice-looking website, a bunch of errors in its English, by the way, but a nice-looking website. They even put up a nice Facebook page that kind of looks like you might expect an antivirus software company to use. And they did an extraordinarily I think surprisingly sophisticated set of activities to try to get dissidents and anti-regime activists to get to install spyware onto their machines. Here's a great example of a PDF file. This is, by the way, from documentation from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which has done great work uncovering what the Syrian regime has been doing. You can see here is just a simple PDF file. And the file itself contains information that a dissident might expect to find about meeting points and schedules for anti-regime activities. But buried within it are a whole set of files that once you open the PDF get installed on your computer, and they place on your machine a background process that does an amazing number of harmful and horrible things. They use a piece of widely spread malware called Dark Comet, which does things like capture your webcam feed. It can turn your webcam on and off at will, records all your keystrokes and ships them to a Syrian server, steals passwords, disables your antivirus software, at least the notifications, so that you can't see it telling you that these bad things are going on. And so the group behind this, I should say that activists have responded. You can see here that this is an image of something in Arabic which roughly translates to this: Assad supporters are centering dangerous files with hacked accounts. Don't be tricked. Check with your friends before opening an attachment. The Union of Syrian Free Students. These kinds of images proliferate around the Syrian internet today as the activists are trying to respond to this sustained series of both state-sponsored and loosely confederated pro-regime activist attacks on their activities and their operations. And it's really quite brazen. This is actually the website for the Syrian Electronic Army, they call themselves. They have a website that's quite straightforward about what they do. They celebrated, for example, yesterday the hack of the Al Jazeera websites that they pulled off because they were unhappy with how Al Jazeera was covering the conflict in Syria. They've got, of course, a Twitter account, the official Syrian Electronic Army. Their Facebook accounts have been shut down a number of times. I just this morning was able to find a new version. This time they call themselves the Army Syrian Electronic, and so that appears to have not triggered the Facebook automatic filters. I bet this will be shut down pretty soon. You can see the helpful message, Bashar Assad, you will never walk alone here. But so this group of people that do not appear to be specifically state actors, in other words, they're not like employees of the Syrian government, but rather a globally spread group of regime backers that have been funded one way or another to produce this kind of malware and to spread these kinds of attacks. All right, that's story number 2. So Egypt, Syria. Story number 3, I want to talk about a really interesting phenomenon that's been happening over the last couple of years, which is the spread of what are called Chinese Weibo sites. So these are essentially cloned knockoffs of Twitter. So microblogging, they generally have longer than 140 character limits, but same basic idea as Twitter. And the usual story about China these days is that it's got this great firewall and engages in this ruthless and relentless censorship, and all these foreign services are blocked. When I was at Google for a number of years, I ran the company's effort to try to deal with China, figure out how to deal with the Chinese government and so forth. It was incredibly eye-opening. And yes, the Chinese government does engage in censorship at a large scale and with the active participation of both domestic and foreign companies. But the story on the ground inside China is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting than that. And these Weibo sites kind of stand at the center of what that phenomenon is. So this is what it looks like. This is Sino Weibo, which is the largest one. They're clocking in at about 375 million users and still growing fast. When we add in the other Weibo sites, Tencent has a Weibo and others, other major players have Weibo sites. We're talking about well north of 400 million Chinese people that are using these microblogging services. And what's interesting about it is that the fundamental effect of these services has been to essentially bring to a close the days in which the Chinese government could control the spread of news. Now, they try very hard still to pull it off, but what we see time and time again, and incident after incident in China, is that even though the Chinese government can descend with the full force of its power and the participation of these services to scrub the internet clean of these bits of news that it doesn't like, there is always now this 15-minute, 30-minute, maybe 2-hour window in which the news spreads and it gets out and people pay a tremendous amount of attention to what happens on these Weibo sites and they see what's going on and they see in the most brazen and naked fashion you can imagine the hammer of censorship come down on the bits of news that they're interested in. So what you see here is just a screen capture of some pictures that went up on Sino Weibo from a moment of social unrest that erupted in a town called Jili. These were tax-related protests, and the army moved in this very heavy-handed way, started to rough up the protesters, and they responded with force. And these pictures, you will not be able to find them on Sino Weibo now, but there was nevertheless this window of several hours in which they were out there, and people grabbed them, and they copied them, and they saved them on their hard drives, and they send them to each other using whatever means they can. And so in China, though the government is trying very hard to extend its ability to control information, even on these services is finding it essentially impossible to do. And so the government's response has been to try to require what they call real name registration. In other words, you must go and show a photo ID to an employee of this service in order to get it associated with your account so they can see what your activities were. They're also trying to impose that kind of policy on internet cafes where you've got to sign in with your ID card at the door in order to get to a computer. Likewise, the Chinese government has been trying to impose ever greater requirements on these intermediaries, these companies like Sina and Tencent and Baidu and the other major players in China to force them to do ever more proactive filtering of content. They've been talking in public about the need to require pre-screening of video. I mean, imagine if YouTube had to have human beings pre-screen every video uploaded to YouTube. It's hard to imagine how that will come to pass, but the government is that desperate that they're talking about those kinds of extreme measures. What's interesting, though, is that there is also a dark side to this phenomenon, too. So on a somewhat lighter note, decide if this is lighter or not, in the Olympics in London a couple of weeks ago, there was a moment when a 16-year-old Chinese swimmer did so unbelievably well at one of her events. In fact, actually, I think swimming faster in the second half of the race than Ryan Lochte had done in his swim. People were saying, like, that really seems hard to believe. I wonder if some doping has been going on with this girl. She came out of nowhere. And the U.S. coach, in fact, John Leonard, said something to that effect, which is, I hope they're going to look into this and see if there was foul play involved in this race. And so the Chinese internet kind of went crazy about this, very nationalistic sort of way. And a very famous Chinese entrepreneur and computer scientist named Li Kaifu actually got really angry about this and posted a Weibo update that included personal information for this guy, John Leonard, including his phone number, his email address, and cell phone numbers, public information that he had found on the internet but by concentrating the attention of Weibo land onto this one guy, he got an unbelievable flood of everything from death threats to insults, and was overwhelmed by this kind of Chinese social assault. And you do see that when, for example, the Japanese do something that the Chinese don't like, either with regard to disputed islands, or their leaders go to visit a shrine in Japan that includes war criminals from World War II. You can also see these Weibo sites concentrate Chinese public attention in a way which you may find sort of disturbing. The other sort of dark side to this Weibo cloud is represented by something that's become known in China as the 50-cent party. So the 50-cent party are people that the government pays half a yuan to per post to put up the official party line on social media sites, and to kind of spread the official narratives and the official stories that the government is trying to push. And so what they're doing is, instead of relying on censorship in the land of the Weibo, they're trying to direct the narrative and steer the narrative by creating sort of the social background noise that carries the party's public line. And that's a way in which these Weibo sites can be vehicles for effective propaganda. If you look to see the validation of a message through the number and the scope of the people relaying it, these 50-cent party type activities can be very effective. We see the same sort of thing in this country sometimes in sites like Yelp, where you can never really know whether the review you're reading is one you should trust. In the world of politics, though, I think there are some very potentially disturbing implications to that kind of activity, and whether the Chinese will sort of get away with it in some sense. Of course, everything in China includes a kind of I shouldn't say everything. Like many things in China, we see a kind of a fun, lighthearted kind of cat and mouse game between Chinese citizens and the censors that exist in the companies or through the government. This was just a fun one that I saw last week, which was somebody caught on video and in still images a policeman beating up protesters at one of these moments of social unrest. And the Chinese internet responded by doing, of course, what you would do in this country, which is the equivalent of kind of a animated GIF on Tumblr meme, and started putting this policeman into everything from munch paintings to movie posters to soccer games and the Olympics. And that is part of the way in which these Weibo sites are facilitating dissident speech and counter-censorship, counter-regime speech in China, which is through humor, somewhat encouragingly. Okay, so we've talked about Egypt, Syria, China, sort of the good and the bad, and I want to also talk about something that happened in this country earlier this year, which was the fight against SOPA and PIPO, which were companion pieces of legislation in the House and the Senate that were essentially stopped in their tracks by an extraordinary surge of citizen activism through the internet. And what's extraordinary about what happened is that these bills were greased to become law, which is to say that they were backed by Hollywood, and Hollywood nearly always gets what it wants in Washington. They were backed by the relevant committee chairs and leadership of both the House and the Senate. And they were on a schedule to become passed and to become law in December and January. And so what happened, though, was that on these two dates, the date of the key House vote and the date of the key Senate vote, a whole number of internet websites, including big companies like Google, Tumblr, where I was until recently, and iconic internet properties like Craigslist and Wikipedia, and a number of individuals with their own blogs, either on WordPress, they all took action. And the action was to try to direct Americans to contact their representatives and to express themselves in a very direct way about these bills. The content of the bills was something that we shouldn't forget, which is to say it would have instituted essentially an internet censorship system for the United States that just, with all of our rule of law and other kinds of protections aside, would have given the government the ability to go in and given Hollywood content owners the ability to get content taken down off the internet in advance of what it would normally take, which is to say going to court and getting a judge to issue the judgment. That was what was sort of disturbing about it, was that it created this new special way to kill things you don't like on the internet, and then have the courts fix it later, rather than having the courts have to rule on these things in advance. And so Google blocked out their homepage. They did something they'd never done before, which is direct people to take political action through that most trafficked page on the internet. This is the page that they directed you to. It gave you the opportunity to sign a petition. Tumblr implemented a blackout on your Tumblr dashboard that you would have to click through, and when you click through, you would be given the option to enter your address and then make a phone call to your specific senators or your specific member of the House of Representatives. Wikipedia just blacked out its whole site for 24 hours and directed people to various other activities. And I love this graphic because this shows you what happened. On January 18th, in the Senate, in the House, there were 80 supporters and 31 opponents, and 24 hours later, it had flipped to 65 supporters and 101 opponents, publicly declared. And that shows you how rapid Congress reacted to this extraordinary surge of phone calls, emails, and face-to-face visits from constituents that they got. And so SOPA and PIPA are now essentially dead. And that is really an extraordinary thing. I worked in Washington a number of years, and it is very rare that you see that kind of like surge of public input have an immediate reaction and an effect on the legislative process. It's very rare. And this was all done through a set of informal organizations that came together around these bills and that today are kind of living on in various ways. All right, so this is my broad theme, as you can tell. It's that internet good, internet bad. Internet, the greatest platform for free speech and the facilitation of collective action ever, and versus internet as the greatest vehicle for censorship and governmental surveillance that we've ever known. And the question then is, how is this going to turn out? What can we do to bend the arc of the internet towards freedom and privacy and away from censorship and surveillance? We saw the good that the internet can do in places like Egypt in getting people out onto the street, but we've also seen the way that it can be used to track down and identify regime opponents who can be arbitrarily arrested and jailed, or to have their speech and their thoughts and expressions just disappeared off of the internet. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about surveillance. We've talked about censorship some up until now, but one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that there is such a thing as good surveillance. In other words, our law enforcement agencies and the people that keep this country safe do get incredibly valuable information from watching what our known opponents are doing. It's just true. Whether they're child pornographers, scamsters and fraudsters, or people trying to organize domestic terrorism in this country, or their foreign counterparts around the world, we get good intelligence. The saving grace of the United States and our peers in other democracies is that we have a rule of law framework that provides some basic levels of protection to us. Now, it doesn't always work. If you remember, the Bush administration went in and simply instructed telecom companies to engage in warrantless wiretapping of American citizens in the wake of 9/11, and the companies did. That was despite the fact that there was an available legal mechanism that they could have used. They simply found it annoying and time-consuming, and so they simply went around it. So it's not like our system of rule of law is foolproof. It's not like it's perfect, but it does give you that level of protection. The problem is that those levels of protection, generally speaking, when they exist, apply only to governmental action and governmental surveillance. What you see here is a really amazing graphic that is well worth going to check out online. It's on Die Zeit, this German website. And what you see here is a snapshot of this great little demonstration of what happens when private companies are engaged in surveillance-like activities. So this was produced by Malte Spitz, who is a member of the European Parliament from the Green Party from Germany and a kind of hardcore privacy activist. And what Malte did was he used German data protection laws and the rights that come along with that to get the his telecom company, Deutsche Telekom, to give him all of the records that they had about him over a period of a couple of years from carrying a mobile phone. So if you don't know this, you should know that every minute your cell phone is sending a couple of pings to a tower nearby so that your telecom carrier knows how to send calls to you, and it's essential to the functioning of the network. But those telecom companies, AT&T, T-Mobile, and so forth, keep long log files of all of the pings that they've ever gotten. And what you can see in this graphic, if you ever go check it out, is over the course of several years, you can literally watch multispits move around Germany and move around the world from the records that his telecom company kept. You can even see which way the tower thinks, which directional antenna on the tower was the one lighting up with his signal. So one of the things that all of our rule of law doesn't really give us a lot of protection from is companies, whether it's the carriers that give you the connectivity or the internet services like Google and Facebook and Twitter that you use through those carriers, it doesn't give you protection from their aggregations of data about you. And the kinds of surveillance that that makes possible are kind of extraordinary. Now, one good bit of news is that this is not something that the governments are completely ignorant of. The Obama administration, for example, has been trying to get some kind of baseline privacy legislation passed. In the United States, we have a whole bunch of different kinds of privacy laws, one for healthcare, one for financial data, actually one for your videotape rental records, which is the strongest privacy law we have because it came out of the wake of the Clarence Thomas hearings when people found his like porn rental records at a video store. But we don't have a kind of cross-cutting baseline that sets basic expectations for what privacy protections Americans can expect from these sorts of companies. Okay, so what makes all of this so difficult and so much more complicated than the kinds of policy issues that we've dealt with in the communications area in the past is that the internet is truly a borderless medium, and laws and the protections that can come along with them exist only within borders. So if your data is stored in China or if it's stored in Germany, you can't rely on the United States to protect you. And because of the borderless nature of the internet, that is just a fundamental risk that we all sort of bear. And just to say a few things, to say one sort of important thing, it's easy to talk about censorship and surveillance in the context of China because the government there does it blatantly, and they do it for the explicit purpose of political preservation, the preservation of power. One of the things that's been happening in the last couple of years in a very dramatic way has been that democracies have now started to put those same kinds of tools and techniques to work, often through democratic processes. For example, in Germany, which is obviously a democracy, the government has a set of rules about Nazi-related content, the denial of the Holocaust, expressions of support for war, extreme violence, and so forth, which are totally democratically validated within Germany. This is a set of measures that has strong support from the German people as an expression of their own national shame and disgust at what happened in the 30s and the 40s. Nevertheless, they use their laws to try to keep content off the internet. They engage in active censorship within a democratic context. Likewise, in India, you see that the national goal of kind of coexistence among Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Jains, Christians, Buddhists, and so forth, who have long histories of killing each other, has led the government to erect a fairly elaborate censorship system in India. And we could say the same thing about Turkey, where they are, for kind of odd historical reasons, highly focused on punishing insults to the memory of Kemal Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey. In Thailand, we recently saw Chiranuk Premchaiporn, who runs a message bulletin board in Thailand, be prosecuted because of something that a user uploaded as a comment on her site. And that is a government which may or may not be democratic. South Korea, Pakistan, Russia, Indonesia, Iran, Nigeria, Iraq, Malaysia, Mexico, Venezuela, France, and Australia are all countries that in the last couple of years have proposed or implemented some kind of internet censorship mechanism based on the local concerns and proclivities that are expressed in those countries. So this wave of censorship and surveillance activities is not just in places like China. It's in democracies, maybe most disturbingly too. Okay, so just a couple of things about the numbers here. We're now getting close to about 7 billion people on the planet. The total number of internet users is about 2.3 billion. The total number of mobile phone subscribers is 6.1 billion. Isn't that incredible? Now that's some double counting. There are a lot of countries where you will have 2 mobile phones or 3 mobile phones, especially in the developing world, but it's probably fair to say that about half of humanity now has a mobile device at their disposal. And the total number of smartphones, which is to say computing devices that sit in the palm of your hand, is now topping 1 billion. So if we look at the list of where the growth is happening, so this is a list of the top 10 countries for growth from 2008 to 2011 in the internet. 2 of them are active and explicit censors, which is to say China and Iran. This is measured by Freedom House, which is an advocacy organization in Washington. But 6 of the countries in the top 10 list for growth are countries that are doing censorship, even though they're not the worst actors in that area. Really only the US and the Philippines have essentially unfiltered, unrestricted internet in the top 10 in terms of growth. This is the same chart showing mobile phone subscriptions. These are the top 40 countries measured by total numbers of subscriptions. And here we see Saudi Arabia, Iran, Vietnam, China, all active censors in that list, and a majority that are engaged in censorship of one kind or another. And if you look at you kind of want to get a sense of the future, this is a chart showing desktop versus mobile internet in India, and you can see that mobile is now more important than desktop, getting more traffic in India, which is one of the fastest growing countries in the world. Those are the devices which are most likely to betray your location, most likely to be subject to active government control. Okay, so let me just bring this to a close by stepping back a little bit and saying, okay, what's happening? So an incredible thing to keep in mind every so often is that if you have a smartphone in your pocket, this device holds more computing power and more storage than the entire US government had available to it when that the NASA program, I should say, had available to it when it put a man on the moon in 1969. And the reason that that's so is because of something called Moore's Law. Moore's Law is sort of a prediction that Gordon Moore, who was the founder of Intel, made back in the 60s, that computers would basically double in their power and double in their storage capacity every 18 months to 2 years. So in other words, the price performance of a given chip will double every 18 months to 2 years. So what that means is that if you wanted a terabyte of computing memory in 1992, it would cost you something like $5 million, and it would look like that. It would be the size of a refrigerator. In 2012, it's $79, and it sits on the corner of your desk. That shows you how far we've come, at least in my case, just since I graduated from college. If we had the same kind of price dynamics with automobiles, then a car which cost $20,000 new in 2007 would cost about $2,500 new today. It would cost about $350 new in 5 years. That's what Moore's Law means when you apply it. The cost to run an internet application has gone from $150,000 a month when LoudCloud, which was Mark Andreessen's company, launched its service in 2000. It's kind of commercial grade cloud hosted application service. And now if you go to Amazon AWS, it's about $1,100 a month for the same service. That's a 100-to-1 price drop in just 12 years. This shows you global internet traffic and how it's spiking. As recently as 2000, the total global number of broadband subscribers, which we define as, let's say 2 megs or better, was about 38 million. Today, there's 1.2 billion broadband subscribers on mobile devices alone, which is quite staggering in 12 years. And it's not just the developed world. I mean, this is a picture of what Africa looked like in terms of its submarine undersea connectivity in 2001. There was a single cable called the Sat3 WASP cable, which ran on the down the western shore of Africa. Today, a number of cables have been laid that connect up the continent on all of its shores, and by the end of this year, there's going to be even 3 or 4 more. So even Africa is getting the kinds of fast fiber-connected speeds that we've gotten used to in this country. This brings to mind this old saying of the science fiction writer William Gibson, which is, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet. But we're getting there. So another thing, so that's Moore's Law. Another thing that's making these revolutions possible and these tools and capabilities is the very architecture of the internet itself. This is a chart from one of the earliest theorists of the internet named Paul Baran in 1964, and what he showed was what he was aiming for with the internet's design. On the left-hand side, you have the old-fashioned centralized telephone network. In the middle, you have kind of what the phone network had evolved into, and on the right, you see what he wanted, which is to say, end-to-end connectivity, a mesh of connectivity where each point on the network could reach each other point through multiple paths, rather than having to rely on the power of AT&T to always route and terminate your call. And so, of course, the internet is complicated, it is much more concentrated than that, but in general, it has lived up to this billing that, that any endpoint on the internet can reach any other endpoint, absent some architectural flaw or effort of government control like I showed you in Egypt. So the internet got this fundamental architectural nature that supports the democratization of information and therefore the democratization of power. Another phenomenon that's making these things possible is something called abstraction. So abstraction is the idea that things which other people, things which used to be hard, in other words, things which you used to have to do yourself, can be done by other people and turned into kind of blocks or modules that you can just build on. So you can abstract the need to go and code, for example, if you want to build a mobile app for an iPhone, you don't have to write all of the code for the gesturing that you want to take advantage of. Somebody will have built a module for gesturing that you can just build on top of. So what that means, though, is that for people that are interested in startups, for example, you need less and less and less technical skill to do more and more and more things. You don't have to know how to code a mobile app from the ground up, from the kernel to the user interface. You can rely on all kinds of building blocks that other people have built. What this means is that today programmers and developers are much more like DJs than they are musicians. You're remixing a bunch of things that have been built by other people into the thing you want, rather than having to do it all yourself. And what this means, the internet model, Moore's Law, and this principle of abstraction, is that we're getting this incredible amount of disruption. And the disruption comes in the form of services like Kickstarter, which is this really great company that allows you to propose a project, get backers to fund it, and then make something that would otherwise not have gotten funded. For example, a movie or a record where you might have been dependent upon a film studio or a record label to fund it. Now you can just go straight to your audience, get the thing financed, and then make it. This year, it's estimated that Kickstarter is going to steer more funding towards the arts than the National Endowment for the Arts, which is really an amazing achievement. It's highly disruptive of the old financing models that depended upon these gatekeepers like movie studios and record labels, book publishers, production companies, and so forth. Airbnb is a commercial service that lets anybody put their spare bedroom out for people to stay in, or their couch, or rent out their whole apartment, and it's enormously disruptive of the old hotel model. It may well be that in the next couple of years, you'll start to stay more often in other people's homes than you will in a hotel, and it's because the internet allows you to reduce those costs of search and discovery, form the connections, do the transactions, and use a bunch of social signals to protect yourself against scamming and fraud, all of which is possible thanks to these ever cheaper connectivity, the distributed model of the internet, and this abstraction that allows more rapid development of more services by more people. So that gets us to borderless and speedy internet, plus cheap computing and storage, plus devices in ever more hands, equals the potential for disruptive startups to go from local to global essentially overnight. So I'm going to end with just a little personal story about all the things that can go wrong. So in 2008, I worked on the Obama campaign I was an early and active guy on the tech side. We did a whole bunch of interesting and innovative things on that campaign. And then I joined the transition team, and I went into the White House after he was sworn in. And I got there a huge lesson in what happens when all of the promise and the potential of the things that I've just tried to sell you on being excited about run into the reality of the way that the institutions that govern us are structured and the way that they operate. And just one little anecdote for what this sort of meant for me personally, just to capture how annoying and frustrating this can be. So at the beginning of 2010, there was a big earthquake in Haiti. And it happened in the middle of the night. And when I woke up that next morning, I saw the news, and I happened to have Skype open on my machine. And it just so happened that because of a prior job, I knew the three sort of chief technical people for the three ISPs in Haiti. And two of them were online and visible on Skype when I woke up that morning. And so I got in touch with them, and I sort of asked them how they were, and I was in the White House at the time, and so I was trying to figure out if there's anything I could do to help them out. And the situation in Haiti was so dire. Their submarine cable had been disrupted, the landing station was destroyed, the cable was cut, and the only communications going in and out of Haiti at that time was a microwave link that ran across the border into the Dominican Republic that was run by one of the ISPs. And they were sitting in this facility at the top of this hill that overlooks Port-au-Prince called Boudier Hill. And they, up until then, had been using something called WiMAX to just sort of send connectivity down to their customers down in Port-au-Prince. But now all of those boxes down there were destroyed, but they had this one link going in and out. And no electricity. So what they needed was fuel for their generators to make sure that this one link wouldn't go down. The two mobile phone companies had connections up there, so it was a reasonably good communications option. Anyway, the point of the story is this. So I was sitting at my house, like doing this on Skype, and I rushed into the White House complex where my office was to try to start relaying messages from these guys to the people at the Southern Command, which the president had designated to lead the U.S. response, so that they could send some trucks when they were able to and send some fuel to these guys. But when I got to my computer in the White House, I tried to get Skype installed, and I realized that it was blocked. So the government blocks Facebook, Twitter, Skype because of a whole bunch of reasons, including things like the Presidential Records Act, which requires that we keep records of every email and every communication generated in the federal government. And so anyway, what I ended up doing was violating all of the rules about having your own equipment with you, and like had a Verizon Air card attached to my laptop here. I don't know, I ran home to grab it and then bring it back into the White House, and so I would do Skype over here and then turn and like type emails to Southcom over there and then go back and do Skype over here. Anyway, excuse me. Anyway, it just, at that moment, captured for me all the ways in which this great promise and potential can run aground of the institutions that we live in. Now, there is this other way that government could reform itself, and if any of you have heard of Code for America, which is something that I'm on the board of, and it's a really great organization that was active in Portland last year. There's kind of a civic technology movement that's trying to realize this, which is unlike how we're used to dealing with government, which is to say that you treat it like a vending machine where you stick your taxes in here and you get your services out the bottom, and civic involvement basically amounts to like banging the machine when it doesn't give you the candy bar you're expecting. There's a way to treat government more like a platform, which is to say that government can provide information and services to its people much more in internet style. So it is possible for government to act in a more internet-like way. One of my favorite examples from last year was that in the wake of the financial collapse, Iceland set about to rewrite its constitution, and they did it in what I think was kind of an exemplary way. They had a website, they used Facebook, they used Twitter, they held meetings and always recorded them and put them up on YouTube. They used Flickr to keep track of all the meetings that were happening, and they ended up with a constitution that had been the product of a tremendous amount of public consultation, face-to-face, of course, but also online in a very civil way. Another great example is in Latvia. Two guys had this idea that they should come up with a much better way of doing petitions to the Latvian government and worked with the parliament there to create this great website called Monavals, where anybody can propose an idea for the Latvian legislature, and it goes into kind of like a hidden web page. And your job as the proposer of that idea is to use Facebook and Twitter and these other tools to get, I think in their case it's 1,000 people to go and give it kind of a thumbs up. And when it reaches 1,000 backers, then it flips around to the public part of the website where anybody can see it, comment on it, make suggestions, and give it a thumbs up or not. And when it gets to 10,000, the reward is you get 5 minutes, the proposer gets 5 minutes on the floor of the legislature to present the idea. That's it. There's no guarantee that they'll adopt it, no guarantee they'll even take a vote on it, but it's a way to make sure that ideas that have some degree of public support get the backing, get a hearing in their legislature. And by the way, the White House adopted this exact same idea after watching it in Latvia and set up something called We the People, where the payoff, instead of a hearing, is the relevant White House staffer writes a response to your question. It's just a way to make sure that whatever thing you're concerned about, whether it's, of course, the inevitable first question that made it through, marijuana legalization, or something like the president's position on the continuation of the Superfund law to clean up toxic waste sites, you can actually get a response, which is something. So anyway, it is possible for government to do better. I need to put in my necessary caveat here. This is a famous picture from a Chinese rail station where the Chinese characters say restaurant and the English says translate server error. It is the case that technology doesn't magically solve any of these problems, doesn't magically fix any of these things, but used smartly, technology can make government actually work better. Okay, so let me wrap up. In sum, the internet is democratizing and decentralizing access to communications and information. Information is power. The internet is democratizing and decentralizing power. That's my core syllogism. Democratization brings disruption. In data, news, culture, politics, entertainment, business, and so forth, we are moving from passive consumption, where your job is to sit and consume what other people are throwing at you, into a world of active creation, funded by Kickstarter, spread globally by Twitter, and so forth. And so it's on us, right? It's on us to take advantage of these tools that are made available, and to build startups and to build companies that have got global scope and global ambition, that do things like respect privacy by design, that bake privacy into the very code that you are writing, that will fight for users' free speech, like a company like Twitter does, which it doesn't have to do, but they go to court to protect their users whenever they can. It's on us to build startups that deliver new capabilities to individuals, to discover things, to connect, create, to learn, and it's on us to build companies that are going to reduce the cost and friction of collective action, of the kind that has enabled these extraordinary political movements and social movements to reach fruition in the last couple of years. What are the battlefields going to be? Well, of course, they're going to be about censorship and content control, the bad stuff, like political censorship, obviously, but also well-intentioned efforts at censorship to try to stop copyright infringement or to enforce content protection for children, to protect national security. There are all kinds of good reasons people will advance to engage in it, and it's going to be on us to fight that back. It's going to be on us to fight battles about surveillance and privacy, both in governments that have rule of law and, more pressingly, in governments like Syria, in countries with governments like Syria that don't. The most difficult part of this is going to be dealing with companies and their abilities to engage in surveillance and to violate privacy. And finally and fundamentally, it's on us to protect the internet and to keep it open, to keep the networks themselves neutral rather than telling you which places you can go to and which services you can use. It's going to be on us to fight when Congress is headed towards doing things like SOPA and PIPA, which would violate our own principles. In short, it's on us. Thank you very much.